Did we want to need to respond to that?
I'll make a motion if you'd like.
Absolutely.
You up for that?
Yep.
All right, to approve the proposed text for a 45-day public comment period and delegate to the executive officer the authority to adopt the proposed regulatory changes if there are no adverse comments received during the public comment period, to follow established procedures and processes in doing so, and also delegate to the executive officer the authority to make any technical or non-substantive changes that may be required in completing the rule-making file.
I'll second that.
Very nice. Thank you for putting that language right in there. That made it ever so easy. That's awesome. Christina?
Yeah, any further discussion?
Okay. Public comment on?
Okay, Gabriel Lamb,
Aye.
Deborah Brown,
Aye.
Jonathan Maddox,
Yes.
Dr. Peter Chu,
Aye.
Becca Stout,
Yes.
Dr. Christine Whitlisbach,
Yes.
Betty Conley,
Yes.
Christina Wong,
Yes.
Dr. Leah Baru,
Yes.
Alexander Kim.
Yes.
Motion carries.
So Christy, it looks like you're up again.
Yes. So this is another item we've been working on in the exempt setting committee regarding practice setting definitions. I'll preface this by saying this is a work in progress. There's a couple of main components here. The first piece is a little better developed, so I'll continue on with that. So we've been drafting definitions for different types of practice settings that offer mental health services, and always our goal is protecting consumers and trying to clarify our current law. So the Exempt Setting Committee developed it. It was looked at by the Policy and Advocacy Committee. And the Policy and Advocacy Committee is continuing to work on some related language that we expect to bring to the board early next year, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. So bear with me, this is a kind of a long item, and some of it's complex, and I've had to do a lot of learning on it. The committees have done a lot of learning on it, and so like I said, it may require a little more work, but especially this first piece is, in talking about exempt settings, I feel like that piece is it's more straightforward, so we'll get there. So a little background on exempt settings. As you all know, our law specifies settings where you don't have to have a license or registration in order to provide clinical services, and those are nonprofit and charitable entities, all types of schools, whether they're public, private, or for-profit, and governmental agencies. The way the law is written, so these are the only types of settings that are defined in law. We don't, the LCSW law has a private practice definition, but it's very general. The other professions don't have any other definitions. So in exempt settings, I'm sorry. So after reviewing the exempt settings survey results, the committee members expressed an interest in addressing exempt setting agencies where consumer protection may be lacking. And just to back up a little bit, we did a survey of people who are working in exempt settings, our licensees and registrants, as well as exempt setting agency directors. And so it was a very comprehensive survey. We looked at the results, and that's where we came to some of this proposal that you'll be hearing about. So some of the findings that we were concerned with is that there are some agencies who do not fingerprint their employees. And again, these are people who do not have a license or registration with the board. 34% do not have a licensee supervising their unlicensed or unregistered staff, and 15% do not have a consumer complaint process. So the committee developed some language that would require unlicensed or unregistered therapists working in an exempt setting and who are also not pursuing licensure to provide consumers with a printed disclosure prior to initiating psychotherapy that contains information about how to file a complaint about the therapist with the agency. In talking about this, we realized that A lot of other boards require all of their licensees and registrants to provide some sort of disclosure about where to file complaints. So this was a little bit outside of the exempt committee's scope, but it goes hand in hand with this, really. So like right now, if you are a psychologist, a physician, or a dentist, you've probably all seen those posted in your, doctor's offices that medical board licenses and regulates physicians. Here's how to contact them if you have a complaint. So we want to have exempt agencies do this, as well as our licensees provide a disclosure. So that proposed language is provided in attachment A. I think I would let them stop there and see if there's any discussion on this piece.
So I might be a little confused. So you're going to ask exempt settings to do something?
Yes.
So
and
do we have jurisdiction over
We
that?
don't, and so this would not be a law. No, we don't directly. What we do, I mean, the way our law is written, it talks about the employees of those settings. So it's really a fuzzy area, but we've talked about this a lot. We don't have that jurisdiction. There's not any teeth to this, but there are a lot of laws out there that are not enforceable. They are there because they're saying you should do this. And so it gives people something to say, okay, we need to be doing this. And, maybe not everybody will, but it's something that we can try to make it.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
I understand. Thank you. I just wanted to understand.
Any public comment?
Hi again, Kathy with Exempt. I'm almost going to say the exact same thing. So I again thank you for working on this. I know it's complicated, and I know a lot of committees have put input. So thank you for your time and effort, and the committee's time and effort. Same thing. We're supportive generally of the direction you're going. I would just ask, as this continues to be developed, that the committees involved keep in mind the numerous amounts of work settings that are the for-profit, that are in the for-profit arena, but that are regulated by the state. And we do have some concerns that if they're treated more similarly to a private practice, that could harm the amount of placements for our associates and trainees. So again, we look forward to working on the language, and thank you for doing so, and we just hope that you keep that in mind as you develop your language. Thank you.
I don't think we need a motion on that one. It's a little premature.
Yeah, not quite yet. I mean, there might
come
be a
back
separate
and we'll
motion
see
on
if
this,
we can-
there might be a separate motion for this, but we'll get to that. So this is the more difficult piece here, is the for-profit business entities. So that includes private practices and then the whole universe of everything that's not an exempt setting. So I'm going to go through the different types of settings and structures that we've been able to identify, because our law does not, again, have any definitions for any types of this. And so most for-profit settings do not meet the criteria for what's normally considered a private practice or a professional corporation, which in our law, private practices and professional corporations, they are tied together. So other types of for-profit business entities include a company that's owned in full or in part by an individual who is not a licensee. You have partnerships which have multiple owners, can be licensees or non-licensees or a combination of the two. You have general stock corporations, and I have a couple of examples. There's Telecare, which is an employee-owned general stock corporation, or HealthNet of California, which is part of MHN, which is an employee assistance program. So that's just a couple of examples. California, these are fairly new, but we have something called a public benefit corporation and a flexible purpose corporation. And how those are different from a general stock corporation is that it allows those corporations to consider not just the money that their stocks make. There's other benefits that they provide to the community. So it's sort of a new thing here. So those are the business structures that are out there. And then kind of getting into the types of for-profit companies, what do they do? You have mental health clinics, you have substance abuse recovery programs, and then you have medical settings such as hospitals, medical groups, nursing homes, hospices, and dialysis clinics that can be for-profit. Many of these are regulated by the state. The type of oversight is, it really varies. There's from lightly to heavily regulated depending on what type of setting that they are or the services they provide. And they would be regulated by the Department of Public Health or the Department of Healthcare Services. And I just want to point out there's certain non-residential substance abuse treatment programs that can operate without a state license. So that's the one specifically we know can operate without that oversight. Companies that provide mental health services, so they can be owned in full or in part by an unlicensed person. There are no laws on the books that prohibit this. The vast majority of these companies, psychotherapy is not their primary thing that they do. It might be in conjunction with something else. It might be in conjunction with substance abuse treatment. It might be a nursing home or a hospice. Although there might be some that do provide it as their primary service, and they might be a corporation or operate under a state license, which would offer a level of oversight. But there is some concern that there might be some companies that look and operate similarly to a private practice, and this would be likely a rare or unusual setup that could occur, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. This is something I'm hoping to draw on the knowledge of everybody out here. Do we see this, these little companies? So the ones that I'm kind of concerned about as we're making our definitions and figuring out what laws apply to who, is there a company maybe owned by a non-licensee that looks like a private practice and maybe is owned by a non-licensee, but they employ people to provide mental health services. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. So the proposed definitions we've provided in attachment C for private practice and other for-profit settings. So they would be defined separately. And the definitions are designed to clarify which settings must comply with or are affected by each of our laws that currently reference a private practice. And there are a number of laws on the book that reference private practice, and the Policy and Advocacy Committee is, we're going to continue to, based on these definitions, we're going through sort of this list of these laws and saying, okay, should this apply to an agency that's defined as other for-profit? So we're teasing out what applies where. So we're going to continue to work on that. As we went through this work, we considered including other for-profit setting types within the private practice definition. We kind of started there. How, should all those laws apply to other for-profits? Should they all be one definition? But this would subject other for-profit companies to all the laws that reference private practice, and we determined in some cases this would be problematic. And most for-profit companies do operate under a level of oversight, and so those restrictions may be unnecessary. Because we're discovering a lot of those laws were developed because, you have an individual who hangs out a shingle and they're kind of operating in isolation, and so there's maybe a little more risk. And so I want to, let's see here. So again, we're looking at whether those laws should apply to other for-profit settings, and we'll develop some proposed language as necessary, and we'll bring that to the board again early next year. So where I want to dig back in on these companies that are owned in full or in part by an unlicensed person that looks something like a private practice, where should that fit in terms of the definitions, or should those companies be addressed in some other way? If these little companies fall under the other for-profit definition, they would not be subject to the restrictions related to private practice settings. And again, those restrictions are there because they have little oversight. So I want to kind of explore this issue further. I talked to a couple people about, and Roseanne and I have been talking about this. It's not against the law for an individual to, an unlicensed individual to maybe employ mental health therapist, but what if it is in a setting that's unregulated and it, you know, I don't know how, it sounds like this would be a rare occurrence, but I wanted to bring it out because it sounds like it's something that could happen, and is anybody familiar with this? Is it something we should be concerned about? So I'm going to leave that there for some discussion here.
Thank you, Christy. Leah?
I'm not sure of the exact business structure, but I do see that we have a lot of agencies where our students work, where the trainees work, where they're run by a director who's not a licensee or owned by someone who's not a licensee. And when our students try to say, hey, we have to have a private place to do sessions or a private place to do supervision, they don't understand the gravity of that. And I go back to thinking about the news and all the non-residential substance abuse treatment programs that are not regulated by the state. So I think it's probably more prevalent than we have fired a lot of agencies, so to speak. I mean, we don't hire and fire them, but we have removed them from our recommended list because they are not operating, allowing our trainees to operate within appropriate scopes, or not scope of practice, but within the appropriate laws that regulate the profession. And usually it's for financial reasons. They're like, oh, we can't afford that. And it's like, then you can't afford to be doing this work.
And I think that's part of the issue is that financial consideration, especially by someone who doesn't understand the profession and the services provided. I didn't mention it here, but the medical board has some very extensive laws pertaining to who can own a company that provides medical services, and the gravity of that is very severe, and obviously in the medical world there's even worse profit motivations, but so I think that's probably why that had gotten brought to their forefront, but that's good. It's interesting to know that may be a bigger structure than we realized. So.
I would say we have someone pursue our university at least once a year who don't meet requirements. Yeah.
So what's the next step, Christy?
We do have proposed language, and I guess my question is, would you want us? Unfortunately, we discovered this after it went to P&A. It occurred to us that there might be these little companies that have no oversight, and wanted to explore that first. So I brought it here hoping that we could continue to work on this, but this unfortunately isn't as fully formed as I had hoped it would be, bringing it here. So basically, if we include these type of companies that don't have oversight in the other for-profit definition, and then the laws that pertain to private practice don't pertain to these, how do we go about, is this a big enough concern that we want to define these type of companies separately, an other for-profit that's not owned by a mental health professional? Do we want to look into this more as we're developing this, and how great of a concern is it? So I think that's my question at this point. I don't know, Roseanne.
I was going to say, I think we have, as a board and as an agency, we have an invested interest to identify any potential placement setting where students and unlicensed future members of the board are going to train, because we want competent, protected, sort of clinically sound practitioners working in the field to advance the health of all Californians. And if we are allowing students and pre-licensees to be in environments that we don't regulate, we potentially put them at risk, because the people who own these particular companies aren't necessarily motivated by the same values that I would be as a licensed marriage and family therapist. I have an invested interest to see that my supervisors grow clinically developed clinically, I can look at their work and say, okay, you're really not competent maybe to do this work, or these are areas where you need to grow, and someone who doesn't have that training or invested interest could potentially just, create a sort of, for lack of a better term, just a sort of an environment where they're just passing people through who really aren't growing as licensee, growing into competent, sound licensees. And I think we have a responsibility to look into this further and address it, because we are, in doing that, protecting sort of Californians and the public.
Any other comments? Do you have any public comment on the issue?
Hi, Kathy with Exempt. So just to clarify, my comment I made a few minutes ago was to this third bucket. I'm sorry, I thought the conversation was quickly over, so it was to that third bucket. And I just encourage, I do think there's more research and conversation that needs to happen. I think there is a big difference between a licensed person or group owning some of these smaller facilities that's licensed by or regulated by the state versus me just opening one. So we're available, Exempt is available if you ever wanted to have offline conversations. So I just wanted to put that out there, that we're available to talk or research or whatever the BBS would need or want from us.
I've actually been, talking with David,
Yeah,
so he's been
yeah.
very helpful.
Thank you.
Betty? I kind of have a big picture question related. So as we think about what we're doing, I understood the first part of the conversation of, I guess we could request these other entities to say, hey, if you have a complaint, go here. And my assumption would be it wouldn't matter what kind of entity it is, right? Is that? That's if it's considered an exempt setting.
Right, an exempt setting. Well, so the way it's written is if anyone providing service, any unlicensed, unregistered person in an exempt setting has to provide that disclosure. And then any of our licensees, regardless of what setting they work in, also has to provide a disclosure.
Okay.
So we cover everywhere, I believe.
So then what would be the importance of nuancing these different types of settings?
Okay, so this is really separate from that issue. This goes to all of our laws. So, for example, I'll use students as the example. So there's an explicit prohibition in law that students cannot work in a private practice setting. So there are other laws like this. You can't do this, you can't do that in a private practice. And it's been, people call us, what's a private practice? And we don't have anything to point to except in our LCSW law, which all it says is that a private practice is a business owned by one of our licensees. And so it's that list of laws and trying to clarify who do those laws apply to. So, and unfortunately I didn't bring that list because we were working on it in committee, but that's just one example. And so what we're doing here is by separating out the other for-profits, we're saying you don't have to follow all of these laws. So students could be placed in another for-profit, which is already happening, and we haven't heard huge problems, and I know the schools screen.
Most schools screen.
True. There are a lot of schools out there, right? So there's no guarantees on that.
There are online programs, and some of the online programs, the students have no idea where do they go. They call the institutions and say, where can I go for practicum? My school doesn't have any.
Right, so they have to find their own.
Yes.
Right, yeah. And there are places where there are shortages of settings for students, so they can't find a placement sometimes. So, yeah, in those cases, it's none, or it's something like this. So, so what we're trying to do here is, if we separate out the other for-profits from a private practice, then those other for-profits aren't subject to those laws that reference private practice. But one of the things so in the committee, we're going law by law, should this apply to other for-profits? But I am wondering if we're lumping too many other for-profits together, and because they're not all the same. And so some are regulated, some are not. Maybe that's the easy way to say it. Some other for-profits are regulated by the State Department of Public Health, but some are not. Some are owned by licensees, some are not.
So if you have a for-profit that's not regulated by the state and not run by a licensee, because those are the scariest.
Yeah.
That's the highest risk.
Right.
Then are we thinking like, how are you thinking about doing that? Because there still has to be a supervisor there who meets the requirements if they're going to count the hours. So that's, yeah, so that takes care of trainees and associates, but then there are all these agencies, all these entities that provide services with people who aren't even trained to be a therapist at all. I think of like a rape crisis hotline or a suicide hotline. Those are probably good people. I mean, they're doing good work, but something along those lines that are like the substance abuse places that are popping up and have been in the news.
Right, and I think that's the one that's been primarily on my mind.
Yeah,
but
so
there
how do
may
we, I mean, can we say, oh, God.
be-
Yeah, we have no way to touch them, though.
True, but all of our laws that talk about private practice, those could, we could pull those in. So, so going back to the example of students, we could, if we had, and I'm not even sure what this looks like, but if we had the 3 definitions, or if we had the 2 definitions, maybe we could somehow carve this out.
So, Christy, I think what you're saying is, we're trying to identify, we already have some pretty clear definitions about where associates can get hours. But we may not know, but we may not have, what you're saying is that the trainees are the ones that are falling into this gray land, right?
Well, it's
Or it could be anybody?
Any non-person in our field.
So we can't regulate the exempt settings per se, but we can dictate where trainees and associates.
We can protect our people, but the problem
Exactly.
is, how do we protect the public from the people who have no degree?
In exempt settings.
Well, that's kind of a separate issue. That was the first piece we talked about with that disclosure.
Yeah.
But now we're really onto something separate, and that
So
is,
those settings are not exempt.
these settings are not exempt settings, and there's a list of laws that say you can't do this in a private practice, you can't do that in a private practice. So let me give you another example. So I gave the example of students can't be placed in a private practice. So another one is, we have that 90-day rule, right? So there's a law that says you can't work in a private practice during that until a registration is issued. But does that mean you can work in another for-profit and you have no registration with us? There's a gap there, and it's almost, so that's another one that, just another example. What's another private?
I think it would be helpful to look, we have an attachment C, we have the definitions. I think it would be helpful as a starting point to look at the actual definitions that we've crafted. And then the Policy and Advocacy Committee can go through, we've identified in that committee, and we're still looking at it, all of the laws where, this is what can be done with a private practice, and we can decide whether or not, law by law, to include other for-profit settings. I think it's important to nail down the definitions first, and then we can go from there on deciding or expand if we come back and find that we need to expand. But I think that's kind of the first step.
It is kind of the first step, and I think maybe the point of today was to kind of gather some information and thoughts on, are those types of agencies a big concern? And are they out there even? I mean, I knew the substance abuse ones, but there probably are other types that we're not familiar with. So, yeah, today is kind of I thought we were a little more formed had a little more formulation than we did, but we just kind of used this opportunity to get some input so we can move forward with this, so.
So here's what I would suggest. I think for items, attachment C, that's still a work in progress. I think we return that to P&A and work it out there.
That sounds good.
So now, with respect to attachment A, the notification piece, that one's pretty solid. So that would be the one I would suggest that we consider for action, or if it's the board's pleasure, if you want to wrap this all up in one package, we can hold off on this entire proposal until we get C worked out.
And there is one more component that we could talk about that's fully developed, but just to kind of skip ahead a little bit, Roseanne and I have been talking about, since she does the legislation, we feel like the first piece on exempt settings could go into a bill on its own, but the other option is to wrap everything together. It kind of could be its own piece.
Yeah, I like, just from a operational standpoint, I like attachment A on its own. I think it moves forward. I think it does something. We don't see the notification as being terribly onerous. You could include the language in your informed consent form and then just highlight it as you're meeting with your clients. I don't see it as being real onerous, and that's a first step. So I would be comfortable trying to find an author for that particular piece, because it's a consumer protection piece that I think we would be successful with. So if we want to move forward with that and then better develop the other pieces and then run them in a subsequent bill, we can do that.
So I think that makes good sense. So there is one more little language piece in here that I think can go with attachment A, and that's attachment D, and it has to do with just clarifying that LCSW students cannot work in a private practice. It's implied in the law, but we want to just make that clear. So that's the other piece that could move forward in conjunction.
That could do it. Yeah, the other strategy on this is if we have, attachment A and this a D, if that's the board's pleasure to move forward with that legislative proposal, we get the author. At the time we get our other language developed, either we can go back to that author the subsequent year or perhaps add it in. It just depends on when the language gets developed. But this gives us sort of an inroad into this next 2-year legislative cycle.
Right.
Leah?
So as I look at attachment A, this was confusing for me when I read it earlier this week. So each of the professions has sort of a part 1 and a part 2. The part 2 makes sense to me. So the part 1, the notice to consumers, the office unit name of the agency name receives in response to. I don't understand what that statement is.
That statement is for one of those settings, the exempt setting that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
This is for those, I'm thinking of Southern California Counseling, and they're here. But this is basically informing the consumer that the agency has a complaint process.
Okay.
And you can file a complaint with them, and then they will investigate it.
Okay, so that's assuming they have a complaint process.
Yeah, and in our research, when we looked at those entities, they did.
Okay.
They did. The second piece is what we would anticipate the licensee would include in their informed consent, and they would provide that to the client. And if I misspoke, please correct
No,
me.
you're correct. You're correct. There were some that came out in our survey that don't have a complaint process, but they would need to have one.
Well, plus the
This-
people who would answer the survey are the ones that have a complaint process.
Right, that's true.
The people who don't respond to those kind of things are the ones that we're worried about. Not all of them, but
Well, we hit employees, we hit our licensees and registrants working there, so we did find out that some do not, but if this were to be implemented, they would have to at least list somebody where a complaint could be filed, so.
Any more comment from the board? Jan Lee?
Jan Lee Wong, NASW. I commend Christy for bringing this up in the Policy and Advocacy Committee because this is actually very complicated, and it sounds like it probably is rabbit hole. For those people from another country, that means getting into something that's very complex and difficult and goes a long way, usually underground, to a place that's half fantasy. So anyway, I think it's helpful sometimes, and I think the board really got there, and I really want to thank Kim for helping clarify it. You have to kind of go back to what are you trying to do, protect consumers, but you have to attach the idea of who do you have authority over. So you want to protect all consumers in all settings, in all situations, but you don't have authority to do all of that. So you have to keep your limitations in mind. You always have to base it on evidence. You don't want to set policy without evidence. So if there is a big problem out there, where's the evidence? If there's a small problem out there, where's the evidence? And then finally, you really know, and sometimes you should really make the connection that there are other agencies and other avenues to do what you want to do if you don't have the authority. So I noticed schools were brought up a lot, and students. Well, most schools regulate what their students go through as far as their educational program, including online programs. Now, the big difference is, I think, just my opinion, that not all schools are specially accredited. That is a problem. If you have a special accreditation like social work schools, they look very closely at online programs. So there's a form of regulation there. You have a little control over that, even though it's been brought up in the past and you haven't done too much with it, which is to really start looking at, and you have done some research here, how to get some sort of specialty accreditation for some of the other licensees that you have. You know, that would be the route to go. The other thing is the exempt setting thing. This is how this all started. We're heading off over here, and is this really an exempt city? What kind of corporate structure do they have, and on and on. Rabbit hole, rabbit hole. It's pretty simple. If it's an exempt setting that seems like it's difficult to regulate, you might want to think about saying explicitly, these are not exempt settings. Just something to think about, rather than to try to define corporate structures and which ones are which and which way you should go. But anyway, like I said, I think it's a difficult topic, but it's one, you know, that you've chosen to take on, and you just want to kind of control that impulse to, like, let's jump down the rabbit hole.
I like that idea because, just saying what is not, and then the rest, because the corporate structures can constantly change too.
Hi, good morning. Robert Mendelson, Southern California Counseling Center, an exempt setting in Los Angeles. And I think I'm following here. We gave some input on potential language that would be posted pertaining to paraprofessionals. We have both licensure track and paraprofessional counselors. And I don't know where that's going to go, but we think it's a fine idea, and we were happy to give our input. So, yeah, just to sort of log in on that. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's go ahead with a motion on the section up.
No,
So-
I will make the motion if
You'll make
Sabina
the
helps
motion.
with the language.
Sabina? On that section A, the attachment A that we want to do as attachment A that we want to do as a standalone with the additional language that you wanted.
Do you want to do D as well, which
Well,
is,
those are the two that you
A and
said
D.
felt could go together?
Yeah.
So then let's get some language for attachments A and D.
A is regs?
They're both statute.
Okay, so I make a motion for staff to pursue legislation for section A and D. Is that adequate? Okay. And make any non-substantive changes.
Okay, so any more further discussion from the board? Kathy, it looks like we've got some public comment.
Hi, Kathy Atkins with Campt. I apologize, I'm a little confused, but I would just, I'm frankly confused what you're voting on right now, to be frank, but I tend to caution myself that I don't know that I would, if you're still working on language in sort of a third category, is there a potential that you're going to change language in category 1 and 2 if you haven't yet defined 3?
No. The attachment A stands completely, attachments A and D in the packet, which is the motion that they're proposing to run as legislation. It's sort of a separate but related topic. So the language that we're discussing in attachment C will not affect the language in A or D down the road.
Okay.
So Kathy, are you clear on what A and D are?
No, I had it up and then I couldn't find it quick enough, so.
Attachment A is basically the notification of that there is a complaint process.
Yes.
And then D is just a minor cleanup to
Okay.
social work
So
law.
my apologies for wasting your time.
The one, that's okay. The one that we're still kind of going back and forth on are the definitions of the private practice.
Got it.
And then other.
Fair enough. Thank you, thank you.
Okay, any more comment from the public?
And it's attachment D as in dog, not B as in boy.
Okay.
So we do have a motion on the floor in a second.
Yes.
No further comment. Christina, let's go ahead with the vote.
Okay. Gabriel Lamb,
Aye.
Deborah Brown. Aye. Jonathan Maddox.
Yes.
Dr. Peter Chu.
Aye.
Vika Stout.
Yes.
Dr. Christine Whitlisbach.
Yes.
Betty Conley.
Yes.
Christina Wong.
Yes.
Dr. Leah Brew.
Yes.
Alexander Kim.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Right. So we are going to move, we have a presentation. Chris, did you want us to move so that we could see the screen? Is there something? Did I miss something?
No, I'm just trying to figure out where I don't see presentation on here.
No presentation today? We don't? You do have, okay. We are the discussion, we're, just in case we're at the discussion and possible action regarding licensed educational psychologists supervising associates gaining experience hours in school settings.
Betty, did we do 28 that's on?
We're not going to address, I'm sorry, I should have said that. We pulled that item. My apologies, should have said that to begin with. Yeah, we pulled item number 28, so we are moving on to item number 29, which is the licensed educational psychologist. We have Chris Jones here from CASP with a presentation for us, and I'm just wondering whether the board members might want to move so we would have to move to be able to see the screen. So do you want to give us a couple of minutes and we'll shift down there?
The presentation is very similar to the one that we did at the Policy and Advocacy meeting in August. So if those have seen the slides, you don't have a need to move unless you'd like to.
But it was so riveting, we want to see it again.
Then absolutely, please do.
I'm going to get the light.
I'm going to check and make sure. I mean, the only thing I just hit the button. So I don't know. The only thing I didn't do was turn it on. Showing my- Oh, do I need to turn this on? Is this on? I think it's on. Okay. Quite difficult. A lot of movement. Are we good?
If you want to move the microphone, I think I can try to help you. Just maybe this one. Here.
see everything? And I'll stand. Be very. There we go. Is it good? Okay. All right. We set? Good morning. My name is Chris Jones. I am from the California Association of School Psychologists, and I am the LEP specialist on the board of directors. I appreciate the time to present our proposal today. So what we're looking to do is gain access to providing supervision to other BBS associates. We're hoping to gain support from the Board of Behavioral Sciences in addition to our fellow licensee associations. So at this point, we're looking to make some changes that would propose supervision in settings where educationally related mental health services are delivered. That would include public schools, private practices, charter schools, alternative educational settings, community mental health agencies, anywhere that LEPs are providing educationally related services. We believe that this proposal would increase the opportunities for associates to gain hours, experience, and in the various settings that they're looking to gain, to work in professionally. So why are we looking to make these changes? There are many BBS associates that are interested in working in settings that provide educationally related mental health services. But not all schools or facilities employ BBS licensees who can provide the clinical supervision, which limits their opportunities. So placing associates in the school settings has really created some disparity between current education code and BBS regulations regarding who is properly credentialed to provide supervision to these associates. Some of the current supervisors, which are other licensees, who might have limited experience or have never worked in an educational setting, are tasked with supervising associates who have to write and service special education goals and objectives and participate in IEP meetings and other educational things that are related to special education. BBS associates in these settings are providing all of the same services that LEPs are trained to provide. So the question is, why aren't we supervising at this point? So let me give you the background of where we came from for our little story. A few years ago in San Diego County, we had an LEP that was working as a clinical supervisor for the San Diego County of Education, Office of Education, providing services, mental health services, to students who are in a juvenile detention facility. This LEP, who's contracted by the county, had LPCC interns working with him, providing the services. At that point, he was working on the knowledge. I guess the LPC intern had called BBS and said, can an LEP sign off on our hours? And their understanding was yes. So they worked for the year. And then, lo and behold, at the end of the year, turned the hours in, denied by BBS. Lost an entire year of internship. So what this did was spawned a call to us. And the phone call came and said, gave the situation I just explained. Well, LEPs, why can't we do it? Well, it's in the regulations. We can't do that. Then the question came as to why. If associates are providing educationally related mental health services in settings, schools, juvenile detention facilities, and why aren't we doing that supervision? Because that's what our training is. So it was a good question. And I said, all right, let's ask. So we put a survey out to our members, our LEP members, and said, what do you guys think? Overwhelmingly, LEPs came back and said, you know what? we would be interested in supervising. We have associates that work with us when we're delivering ARMs. Over 70% of the people that responded to the survey felt that they would be interested in not only supervising, but willing to take the supervision courses to meet the criteria that BBS has at this point for being a supervisor. So, why is this such a big deal now? This has not been the way it is. This is not what history has shown us. Back in 2011, we had a change in the law. AB 3632 went away, and AB 114 was introduced. So how does that relate to education? What happened in 2011 was that the responsibility of providing mental health services to students in special education was pulled away from the Department of Mental Health and put onto schools. They said, it's now your job. Department of Mental Health's out of the picture. Okay. School district said, how are we going to do that? What is that going to entail? So really what this is that school districts were required to create a model to provide educationally related mental health services. And for those of you that work in education, we know we have more acronyms than anybody does. So this has been referred to as ERMS. So the ERMS is an umbrella term that includes designated instruction and service. This is part of special education. This is a service that is on a student's individualized education plan, or what we refer to as the IEP. It also includes educationally related intensive counseling services, or ERICS, as many districts refer to it. ERICS is not a legal term. ERICS is a made-up term to identify a different level of service. We believe that the term originated in LA Unified because they pretty much make up everything regarding education in the state of California. All right. So schools were tasked with creating a new service delivery model for mental health services. A lot of school districts said, well, the model we have right now isn't really broken, so we're not going to try to fix it. So what they ended up doing is adopting a model that was very similar to what they were doing under AB 3632, but instead of contracting out with the Department of Mental Health, what happened is they started hiring service providers directly to schools. And I know where I live in northern part of Los Angeles County, this actually decimated some of our local mental health community centers because all those providers who were working for those clinics were out of jobs. So they left and came to work for the schools because now that's where they were able to practice. So because of these changes, this is why we need to think about updating the law. So now here we have this great little relationship, or this collaboration between the Board of Behavioral Sciences and the Department of Education. And we all know that different entities don't always play well together. So we have Ed Code and we have the BBS. Ed Code requires, according to AB 114, that all individuals employed to provide ERM services have to have a valid credential issued by the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing with the appropriate authorization to provide those services. What that means is they need to have what's called a pupil personnel service credential. If they do not have that credential, they have to be otherwise trained. So that otherwise trained refers to BBS associates and licensees. In order to run the program or be an administrator of the program, you have to have an administrative credential. So like a principal or a director of special education would typically be the person that would have that authorization. If you have an administrative credential, you can supervise and evaluate employees. You have the opportunity or the ability to hire and fire and all of those things. If you have a pupil personnel services credential, which includes school psychologists, school counselors, school social workers, you can deliver ERMS services and supervise job performance. Does not include clinical supervision. So school districts may hire associates to provide the mental health services in schools, but if they don't have a licensee on site other than an LEP, they don't have the ability to sign off on any of their hours, but they can still work there. They would just be required to get their supervision elsewhere, which we all know is not an effective way of supervising associates. So Ed Code requires a PPS credential to provide supervision to any ERMS program. Again, this is job supervision, not what's considered clinical supervision. But the reality is that when you have interns working or associates working in a school setting, and you have school psychologists or LEPs, or you have other licensees, there's many levels of supervision that are going on. The job supervision for an ERMS program in a school setting, in a private practice setting, in a private school setting, charter school, wherever, includes understanding things like making classroom accommodations and modifications, understanding how the 13 different categories of disabling conditions that qualify for special education impact academic and social functioning, a utilization of therapeutic techniques to aid students in managing their own mental health issues in order to access their academic programs. That is the key to what ERMS is. It is working within providing mental health services to students so they have the ability to access their academic program. They need to learn how to write IEP goals and objectives, participate at IEP meetings, and consult and coordinate IEP services. So now we've brought the wonderful world of special education into mental health services. And you think BBS is complicated? You should read special ed law. So LEPs can provide supervision in all of these areas because that's what we're trained to do. This is our house. So this is just kind of a diagram of what a typical mental health delivery service system, ERMS delivery service system, might look like under AB 114. Up at the top, you would have your director with an administrative credential. They may have a PPS credential, but typically an administrative, which would be like a special ed director, would be the big boss. And then, because we all love our levels of management, we would add in a supervisor for the actual program. This person has to have a PPS credential, doesn't have to have a license. So, but could have a license, could be a licensed, a BBS licensee, but in order to be the supervisor, they also have to have the credential. So then they would have their providers. You could have your LEP over there who's just doing their job. We're not allowed to supervise anyone, so we're working solo. And then you've got your licensees that are coming in, doing their job, and also supervising associates. But the interesting part is that, wow, this works. I'm not going to try to, oh, is that? There we go. All right, got the laser beam going now. You guys watch out. That this provider and this provider, who are licensees, don't necessarily have to have PPS credentials. They could have almost zero experience working in the educational system, but still be providing the supervision to the associates. Oh, it's not me. Another model that could have is you've got your director at the top. You've got your ERM supervisor who has a PPS credential, no license, PPS credential, because that's all that the law requires. And then you have your 4 levels of PPS credentialed people who are also providing services. Your LEP who is licensed, a school psychologist with a credential, a school counselor with a credential, and a school social worker with a credential. Not necessarily licensed. Obviously, the school social worker could have a license. The school counselor may also be an LPCC. They could, but in this model, they're not. They are providing supervision to all of the, They are providing all the supervision to the interns, but none of the hours that they do can get signed off on. But they're still allowed to work in this system. So now that you've tasked the interns with having a job and having to go outside of the school district that they're working at to get to get their hours signed off on.
I'm not clear on the slide.
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just not clear on the slide, so is it okay if I ask a question?
Sure.
So if I'm understanding right, the ERMS director is an administrator. The ERMS supervisor may or may not be a BBS licensed person, but has to have the credential, correct?
That is correct.
That ERMS provider on the far left is an LEP, that's clear.
Yes.
The next one over, that says school psychologist?
Yes. Who also has a PPS credential, because that's all school psychologists have PPS credentials.
Okay. The next one over is the school counselor who is a BBS, could be a BBS licensee, but doesn't have a credential, correct?
No, in this model, we have the BBS licensee that may or may not have a credential. In this one, I'm saying what it could look like if no licensees other than the LEP were involved in an ERMS model. So this is I keep hitting the wrong button. This would be like a guidance counselor at a school, right? Because guidance counselors have PPS credentials. According to AB 114, they are qualified to provide ERMS services to students in special education.
But they may not necessarily have a BBS related.
They would not. In this model, they would not. And it's an example, just an example. And then this one, also the school social worker, a MSW who graduates and is in a program where they get their PPS, but they don't have their license, would be able to provide ERMS services. But still, school districts are hiring interns because interns are available, they need hours. School districts are overrun with need, and associates are available. But in this model, nobody would be able to sign off on any of their hours. They would be required to get supervision outside of the school setting. Okay. So ERMS and ERICs really are services that are meant to provide mental health support so students in special education can access their academic program. This requires the service provider to have an intimate knowledge of a student's disability and how that impacts them in the classroom. Now, unfortunately, there's no specific criteria in the law for how these services are delivered. So much like we were talking about with the issues with mental health settings, this is a gray area. The law says schools are responsible, you got to have a credential or be otherwise qualified, go and do. So there's not a whole lot of uniformity to how different school districts deliver the services. Everyone seems to have a different model. So what is becoming a lot more common is what schools are referring to as a multi-tiered system of support. So this is what that would look like. When a student in special education is referred for ERMS services, the special education, our big thing is we want to put people in the least restrictive environment. We want to minimally impact a student's day so that they do not feel that they are being taken away from their peers. So at the bottom level of this system of support within the ERMS program, You might have consultation with teachers, a student check-in once or twice a week, or maybe some group counseling. Then the IEP team says, you know what, that's not enough, they need more. So we're going to now bump it up. This would now possibly include individual counseling. They call it DIS, again, acronyms, Designated Instructional Services. These are additional services that go beyond the academic goals and objectives that kids are working towards on their IEP. And then maybe some behavior plans. Okay, that's not enough either. So now we need to go up to the next level of service, more restrictive. This is where we're talking about additional family time, additional time and frequency with their individual counseling. Maybe there is family counseling, maybe there's wraparound services. Every district creates their own different model of what that looks like. So in special education, we have to say, okay, we tried this, it didn't work. It worked or didn't work? Okay, it didn't work. Now we're going to move up to the next level. Now we're going to move up to the next level. And so what we have in these situations is that typically what schools will do is this bottom level will often be performed by school psychologist, a school counselor, someone who's ingrained in the school. But the school district now, because there's so much legal, everybody's ready to sue schools because they're not doing the right thing, right? So now we have to show that we're doing something more intensive. We need to really put it in there to let everybody know that we're doing a great job by these kids. So now we're going to move into some DIS counseling. That's individual. All right, so a school psychologist might provide that service. LEP might provide that service. Might be a licensee, might be an associate. But now we're going to move up, because that's not working. Now we're going to move up to the next level. Well, according to popular belief and perception, if I don't have a license, I can't possibly be qualified to provide this service. But if I'm a licensee or an associate who has a license, I must be more qualified than someone who's been working in the schools for many years. So now we've got associates that are delivering the highest level of service, and they may be fresh out of grad school. They might not know an IEP from a rental contract. But we're putting them in those positions because perception is that if they have a license, they're more qualified. Versus the school psychologist has been working for 10 or 15 years and providing these levels of services all throughout their practice. So we really feel that the most logical choice for an ERMS program administrator or a supervisor is an LEP, because we have training in special education and mental health interventions. When school districts hire BBS licensees and associates for these programs, we really do have two levels of supervision that are required. We have that job supervision that we talked about earlier, making sure that they're writing goals and objectives and they are, doing all their hours and keeping their notes and performing well at IEP meetings. Getting those specifics. Do you understand that if a student has an auditory processing deficit related to their reading disability, that they might not do so well with talk therapy? Psychotherapy, laying them down on the couch and having them talk about their issues is not going to work for a kid that has auditory processing deficits because they're not processing language. So we have to find a different way to work with them. And then there's the clinical supervision, the writing, the signing off on the hours and providing all the different aspects that go along with clinical supervision. So the current regs prohibit us from providing this supervision to other BBS associates. Therefore, it excludes them from positions they might be qualified to hold if we could fulfill both roles as a supervisor, job supervisor, and a clinical supervisor. Again, a lot of this supervision is provided by licensees that may not have experience. I know for a fact that in a local school district that I'm very familiar with, the ERMS supervisor hired onto the program in 2011 did not get his PPS until 2014. Had no school background, but was the boss of the program. And the only reason that he had to go and get the PPS was because nobody knew. This was all new. We're all trying to figure out how AB 114 works. So we're going to take a model that's been worked, and we're going to put it in place because it's not broken. We shouldn't try to fix it. But then realizing that, yeah, that model's broken and it needs to be looked at differently. All right. What is a school psychologist? This is the biggest question I get. I've been a school psychologist for 22 very long years. And I still get the question, what is a school psychologist? So I don't want to go deep into detail, but I do want to give you the overview of what it is that we do as our job so that you guys have an understanding about why it is that we feel that we are qualified to provide supervision to associates. We, as school psychologists, we're credentialed, first of all of our programs, we come out with a credential to provide services in schools throughout California. Scientific principles of learning, social emotional functioning to help with school problems. We provide services to students, teachers, parents, community agencies, and the school system itself. We do a lot of consultation. This includes consulting with administrators about how programs are provided in schools. Consultation with school staff about how to develop and implement programs to support students with their mental health and academic access. Consulting with parents and caregivers to assist the understanding of how learning and adjustment, the learning and adjustment processes of their children. So if your child has been diagnosed with a disability and the parent doesn't know what that looks like, we go in and we talk about how it affects them, social emotionally, and how it affects them in the school system. Consultation with community agencies. We are required to know what goes on outside of the school and how we can help parents and students get other resources that are out there that we may not be able to provide in the schools. Consultation and supervision of pupil personnel service workers. Part of our credential is being a supervisor for other PPS credentials. My program that I was in 100 years ago, beat it into our heads. You will supervise school psychology interns. You will make sure that the next generation of school psychologists are qualified to do the job. It wasn't even a choice. It's like my mom said, you're going to college. You're just going. You're just going to college. It's going to happen. All right, I'll do it. We'll supervise. Okay, we will move on. We will move forward the profession. Assessment. We all know that we do assessment. We are testing machines at times. But this is what I want to put forward. Testing is only a part of the job that we do. There's a lot of different things that school psychologists do. Counseling, using therapeutic techniques with children's parents, including parent education. So how does that differ from an LEP? What makes us different? Well, we have a license from the Board of Behavioral Sciences that say we can go out and do private practice. All LEPs are or were school psychologists. I have not actively worked as a school psychologist in 12 years. I've been in private practice for 12 years. I continue to hold my credential because a lot of my work that I do is within schools. I have contracts for school districts where I'm in schools every single day, providing all the services I provided before. So educational psychology looks at educational evaluation, diagnosis of psychological disorders that are related to academic learning processes. Yes, we diagnose. Administration of all the tests that you guys know that we give. Interpretation of those tests and how it relates to academic learning for both academic achievement, motivation, and personality factors. So we're looking at social emotional functioning in addition to just learning styles. And then consultation with other educators and parents on issues of social development, behavioral, and academic difficulties. Development and treatment of programs and strategies to address the problems of adjustment for kids in schools. and coordination of those services for the management of individual crises. How do we get to be a school psychologist? Because I know all you guys are going to leave here today and say, you know what, I'm in the wrong profession. I need to go be a school psychologist. I want to be an LEP. So to become a school psychologist, first of all, we are governed by what CTC says and also the National Association of School Psychologists. A minimum of 3 years of full-time graduate study or the equivalent beyond our bachelor's degree. Programs within California, nationally actually, require anywhere between 450 to 600 hours of pre-practicum fieldwork during our first 2 years of coursework. And then in our full practicum year, we need to do 1,200 clock hours of supervised practice. 600 of those hours have to be in a school setting. The other 600 can be in a clinic, can be in another setting. They don't all have to be in the schools. So in California, once you've concluded your program, we have a master's degree and a specialist degree or a PhD and a people personnel services credential. For those of you who don't know what a specialist degree is, it's what I've been referred to as everything but the dissertation. So it's some like 36 hours of coursework after your master's degree, plus a whole lot of other stuff that just makes your head spin. So to become an LEP, you have to work for 2 full years as a school psychologist. And you can either use your full internship year or another full year that's under the direction of another LEP who can sign off on your ability to provide services that would be within the scope of an LEP. So before we get our license, we have a minimum, before we're even allowed to take the test, we have a minimum of 3,600 clock hours of experience, 3 full years. We're highly trained in the impact that disabilities have on both the education and social emotional functioning of students. We are highly trained in understanding and accommodating students within the educational, family, and community systems. The expertise and experience of LEPs with regards to mental health services and the knowledge of special education, procedure, and process make us the ideal professionals to supervise BBS associates in schools and other clinical settings where ERMS is delivered. This really, truly is our home. ERMS is the intersection of education and mental health. It is our domain. This is where we live. We're experts in disabilities and how those disabilities impact learning and socialization. So allowing us to supervise, well, the licensees, I should take that out because we can't, licensees don't need supervision from us other than the job supervision they would do in an ERMS setting. But associates in schools and other settings that provide ERMS exposes associates to most comprehensive and relevant information available and trains them to be successful professionals in a manner that can't happen without having expertise in both education and mental health support. And actually that supervision for the licensees, think about it this way. If a licensee gets hired to provide ERMS services, but they don't have a PPS credential or have limited experience in education, who are they going to figure out how an IEP works, how to write goals and objectives? They're not going to their clinical supervisor, they're coming to the school psychologist. That's the running joke in education. When there's ever an emergency, who do people run to? The psychologist. Crisis, program, behavior. They come to us for it. Because, just like you guys, when we're in schools, we're the smartest people in the room, right? So this change would allow opportunities for BBS associates to gain professional experience in multiple settings. It would increase their access to different supervisors, because we know that there's a shortage of space, especially with working with kids. And we know that there's a requirement for kid hours for the other licensees. So adding additional support and resources for associates improves the functioning of everybody involved. All right. Thank you.
Don't go anywhere, I have questions.
I'll shut that off. I'm assuming there's a few questions.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that you just stay right there, because I
Yeah,
think we're going
I
to
will-
have lots of questions.
I won't move.
Thank you, Chris. That was really informative.
Thank you.
Well presented, well created. I'm going to open it up to the board for questions. I probably, in all fair disclosure, should say I am an LEP. I am an LEP. And I have seen firsthand both the need and the relevance of everything that Chris has been talking about. I live it, and everything was absolutely spot on, and very much appreciate you bringing that to our attention. So just for clarification, we're at a discussion level right now.
Yes.
We do not yet have a sponsor a bill. CASP is working on it. So it really is just at the conversational level right now, and information. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to board questions. I think Leah had her hand, and then we'll come back to Christine, if that's all right.
Thank you so much for coming in, and philosophically, I like the idea, but I have some concerns, and maybe you'll just smoothly alleviate them, and it'll just be a beautiful thing. And let me give you a little context. My education and training was in Texas, and the structure is a little bit different. Everybody's a school counselor who has to have an LPC in order to provide. They just specialize in schools, and then they have to have a teaching credential. So I'm coming from a really different frame than what we have in California, so pardon my ignorance. So a simple question is, you kept referring to associates. Are you not considering trainees?
Trainees, as far as...
They're still in school.
Yes.
So could they collect, like the LPCCs, they can collect their hours in a school environment. Well, MFTs can also.
Right.
But before they graduate, associates are after they graduate.
Right.
Trainees are before. Are you wanting
I
to do it
believe
for
that
trainees
already
as well?
happens, and as long as, from my understanding, at least the way that it has worked in my experience, is that the trainee hours almost becomes an individual contract with the person that's supervising the trainee. So, for example,
It's not. So for LPCCs, they can, because there's no, it's up to the universities to make the decision about
Right.
what happens before they graduate. But because the MFTs have pre-degree hours, they have to be a licensed supervisor with the BBS or with psychology or psychiatry. So did you want to add that?
Yes.
Okay, that, I just wanted clarity on that one. So how many hours, you talked about the total number of hours by the time they sit for the exam, pre-degree,
Right.
post-degree. What I'm curious about is how many supervised hours are they doing counseling? Is there a minimum on that?
I don't believe that there's a minimum. They don't have it broken down that way. The supervision is broken, for a school psychologist, is broken down into the domains that NASP puts forward.
Right.
So counseling is a domain in addition to assessment, consultation, all of those things. So it's not a specific number of hours. They have to meet the criteria within that domain.
Okay, because as I looked at, I did some reading and homework before today. I noticed that one of the domains is interventions and mental health services to develop social and life skills.
Yes.
So I feel really good that you guys can do that extraordinarily well.
Yes.
But I get a little nervous as we talk about group counseling because group can get messy and ugly as a therapist
Sure.
because people reformulate their family issues into those groups. And I guess to me, there are these, there's this continuum in school systems where some of our students work at agencies where they're really primarily very academically focused, looking at academic outcomes and doing skills training. And then we have some of our agencies that are contracted by schools where students are doing deep psychotherapeutic work to work through trauma from, child abuse or whatever
Right.
traumas they have. And I'm not seeing in your domains or in your supervised practice that second piece, that those deeper psychological issues that of course impact their academic work. So
Within a school setting, when we're doing group counseling, or in private practice where we're delivering group counseling
or individual
or individual
yeah.
counseling, the purpose again is to provide support, help them work through whatever issues that they've got going on so that they can access their academic programs. So if you're talking about deep things, when you're talking about kids, everything impacts academics.
Yes.
Right? So, but that's not typically, that deep psychotherapy isn't typically the practice within a school.
Okay, so that was my guess.
Right.
My concern is my students are getting trained to do that work with these kids. And they're going to sit down in a room with a kid and do that kind of work. And the LEP may not be qualified to provide appropriate supervision for, a student who might be suicidal.
Okay, well, those are almost two different
Suicidal,
aspects. Sure.
or I'm not talking about they're in a crisis, but
Right.
maybe overcoming. I'm just thinking of
Well, we
like,
would-
you use the word counseling
Right.
versus psychotherapy, but my students are trained to do psychotherapy.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's not what the purpose of ERMS is.
Yes.
ERMS is not psychotherapy. ERMS is educationally related mental health services, right? ERICS is educationally related intensive counseling services. So if you're going to go deep dive, that's not typically something that is done within a school setting. That would may or may not be outside the scope depending on what it is that the goal of the counseling is. We are trained in crisis intervention. We deal with suicide all the time.
It's in your scope of practice.
It is in the scope of practice.
But is it
yes.
in your scope of competence?
Yes, it is within the scope. We're trained in how to do crisis intervention. Crisis is a huge, especially with, you want to start naming off, school shootings and things like that.
I'm not concerned about
Right.
crisis because crisis really is about grounding people,
Right.
doing CBT techniques.
Right.
You don't want to go deep diving in crisis. I'm thinking more like trauma.
Right. Well, and again, what is the scope of practice of what they're supposed to be doing within a school? Within a school setting, interns or associates aren't doing deep psychotherapy. That's not the purpose of it.
My students are. I'll just let you know, half of my students, I got 200 students, about 100 of them are in practicum. They're contracted through an agency doing work in the schools, and that's the kind of work they're doing. So, I don't know, we probably need to, if we go forward with this, need to do something about making sure that the LEP says, no, you can't do that work in here. And I'm not sure how to do that.
Can I say something about what you're saying and
Yeah.
then allow you to go on? So I would disagree with that. There really is no ethical way for once an associate closes the door with a student and starts doing therapy that they can say, hey, wait a minute, you can't bring up what happened yesterday at your house between your mom and her boyfriend. That's beyond what we're doing in the school. That's not reality. So the context is I'm a MFT. I provided AB 3632 services in San Francisco County. I'm aware of sort of the client base that actually accesses the service, many of whom are from communities of color, communities where large amounts of trauma and violence and a whole bunch of other societal ills impact their capacity to benefit from multiple environments. So I think what you're saying is, I don't want to say disingenuous, but it's not accurate, because many of the associates and therapists that are on school district campuses have to address that piece first in order to even get to the other piece. So that piece is happening. Therapy is happening. It's not just counseling. It's not just you need to breathe deeper. They are really having to sort of trek through some really traumatic material that I would agree. I don't know that necessarily, and haven't made a decision or anything, that an LEP would be qualified to supervise someone engaging in that level of work. So that's not true based on my experience and my experience of the way our system of care works where I work.
Well, and I don't, I guess my response to that would be that as an LEP or school psychologist, we also don't tell kids, no, stop, you can't talk about that in school, because that's not what we're here to do, right? When the kid walks in and the door is closed, we're providing those therapeutic services to them as deep as it needs to go, because that's what our training is, and that's what we need to do in order to get to the root of what it is that's going on, so that they can move forward and be okay to sit in math class or history class and write that paper. But that has to be the outcome. That has to be the goal. The goal for us in a school, regardless of what it is that, let me back up. The goal for providing that level of service in school has to be an access to your academic program.
I don't think we disagree with that at all.
Right, and so we don't put a limit.
We're totally on that
right,
page.
we're not putting a limit on what it is that we're doing with students when they walk through the door.
I understand that.
Right, and we're providing that level of service to them, and I think that is within our scope of practice.
Yes. I think it's in your scope of practice, but looking at your areas, I'm not sure for every program, for every LEP, it might be within their scope of competence. I know there are some friends of mine who are LEPs who also got the LPCC because their degree was more counseling oriented. So they did get that training in how to demonstrate empathy and how to use a theoretical orientation to do that deeper work when necessary.
Well, and that's what our training is also. I mean, we're trained in therapeutic orientation, rapport, but all of the things that you're speaking about. That's part of the deal.
Chris, would it be appropriate, and Gabriel, I did see your hand. I'm not getting to you. We did it at PNA, we talked about the fact that we're not proposing, or you're not proposing that an LEP supervise all of the 3,000 hours.
Oh, no.
Do you want to talk about that, and absolutely, we'll get to Gabriel.
Yeah, we did. We talked about this at PNA, and I'm a big believer that getting all of your experience in one place isn't going to create an effective professional. That you need to have other experiences. So, we threw some numbers out, anywhere 1,500 hours. I mean, I know that's half, but about 1,200 hours is what a school year would be. Providing an internship for a year under the direction of an LEP, I think, would be reasonable for people that are looking at working in schools. That's what their goal is. I know within my own training program, we were not allowed to stay in the same school site for more than a year. We had to move in and get experience across all levels, preschool through college. So it was important that, I believe that if you're under one supervisor for your whole time and you're in one setting, you're not going to become the professional that you need to be to truly provide the services that are necessary for our clients.
Gabriel, you had a question.
It's more of a comment. I would be hoping that if a student goes and seeks the assistance of an LEP and they go in too deep into personal issues that are unrelated to their educational program, that the LEP will have the notion to refer the student out. I
100%.
would feel very comfortable with that. Now, with regards to the signing off of hours, I I would be happy with that. I come from a very underserved area, and that would really help. Provided that the signing off on the hours would be specific to the specific competencies related to education, learning disabilities, and again, issues related to the educational component, not other mental health problems.
We are not asking to do anything outside the scope of our practice. We understand that we have a niche world that we live in, and but the reality is, and you've seen it, Jonathan, you've seen it in your communities, that schools are becoming the center for providing mental health support to students. And the needs of the community have increased in both frequency and frequency and intensity of services. And the demands of our jobs as mental health professionals have changed over the last, I've seen it, if you're in the business long enough, you see everything come and go, right? So we know that the need is there, and we're interested in providing that niche that we live in to help the professionals, the social workers that want to be in schools, that want to, that want to work with kids in education.
And Leah, you do have another question. I just want to piggyback on what Chris has been talking about, which is, and you alluded to it, and that is that I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the scope of practice, and that people tend to think of LEPs as being extremely limited. And I think, Chris, you did a nice job of articulating and showing that scope is quite a bit broader than what many, even fellow professionals, really have an understanding of. And I think that speaks to a lot of the questions is, are we talking about this piece of the pie, or are we talking about a significantly larger piece? And I think, Chris, I just appreciate that. So, Leah?
So just two more questions. I'm going to get back to that, but this is the quick, easy question. In your handout, which was really helpful, thank you, number 2 in the very first section, the proposed changes would allow LEPs to supervise BBS, we'll say trainees and associates, to provide educationally related mental health services in educational and clinical settings. So I was just curious about the clinical settings outside of educational. Like, why is that specified differently?
Well, because it's not just schools. It would be private practices.
Okay.
It could be, if an LEP is working in an alternative setting that would, like a juvenile detention facility that isn't necessarily considered educational, or a mental health clinic that has an LEP who comes in to provide that section of service.
Yeah.
There's a lot of private practices that are now almost like multidisciplinary teams.
Yeah.
And so that would provide opportunity for associates working in that setting to be able to get experience in the ERMS area.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. Thanks, that was helpful. I guess I would, and I know Jonathan has questions too, I would feel more comfortable if I could see evidence of sample programs that show treatment of DSM diagnoses, trauma-informed care, doing that deeper psychotherapeutic intervention, that it's not just part of the training, that it's part of the supervised hours. And because I just want to make sure that they can, because the need is there, I don't doubt that at all. But I don't want, clients who have trauma are the most fragile of all.
Right.
And I want to make sure that the supervisor is well-trained and had their own clinical supervision, lots of it, in order to do trauma-informed care. So that's kind of where I'm sitting. That's where my line, yes, it's in the scope of practice, and yes, some people get trained in it. But in looking at the standards on the CASP.org website, or CASP Online, I just don't see that depth, or even like group counseling. There's like educational groups and doing some processing with that, and then there's like experiential group, and so I'm not seeing that. So I think for me to feel really comfortable to support this, I would want to have more evidence of that, of some sample programs that show what courses are there and how many hours that people typically get. That would be helpful for me.
Thank you. Peter?
Thank you. Thanks for coming in. And I really don't have a question. I only have a comment or observation. I can support the proposal, as long as you get 1,200 out of the 3,000 hours is supervised by LEP, and specify what type of experience the associates will be getting under the school setting. And then the details, all your concerns, I think it can be hashed out at the committee level, and then it can bring back to us, and then we can find a sponsor or whatever and make it happen.
So just for clarification, it's not a bill that BBS is going to run. So, yeah, no, CASP approached us with this proposal and what we thought of the idea. So we thought it would be really beneficial to have them come and do the presentations and explain. My guess is that they'll find an author, and we'll be discussing the bill at February at the earliest, May at the latest. And at that point, then, it would be up to the board to decide to support or remain neutral or oppose the bill. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So, but
out of today's discussion, I'm hoping that maybe we can pass the motion, like to support it in concept or something.
So I was next.
but you can
Go
direct
ahead, Kim.
staff to work.
Okay, Jonathan?
So I want to say thank you for the presentation. That was very helpful because I learned some things that I actually didn't know before. But I have a very similar aligned concern with Leah about, I know the number 1,200 sounds impressive to everyone in the room, but the question is, once again, what is happening during that 1,200 hours that qualifies an LEP to actually, this is more of a comment than a question, to actually demonstrate that they are competent and capable to supervise an associate who is, going to work with some of the most marginalized, fragile kids that actually come into mental health services. And while I know as a practicing practitioner that there is the writing up of the paperwork, doing the LEP evaluation, getting everything on paper, doing a treatment plan, and then what actually happens, because you can't really you can't treatment plan for everything that occurs in therapy. We need to be ensured that the supervisor is capable of managing those things that don't fit into that small vein related to, supporting, resolving issues that are impacting the academic setting, academic learning, which are all critical things, but broader things happen in treatment, for example, in group therapy and in individual therapy, that I would be concerned that an LEP supervisor could hold and manage and has had the experience and training to be able to do that. So I'm just reiterating what she said.
Well, obviously, I can tell you from experience that LEPs, school psychologists, are masters of multitasking, and that we are that I don't know a school psychologist that hasn't done all the things that you're asking us to do, and I do feel and wholly believe that our level of training would satisfy your concerns.
Sure.
Because we're seeing those kids, school psychologists are seeing those kids every day. LEPs are seeing those kids every single day.
So
And-
I understand your
right.
passion, and I don't doubt that, but the motto for Missouri is it's the show me state. So I'd like to see some things on paper. I'd like to see some data that demonstrates that that's the case. And so.
So this goes back to the question of what do some programs look like?
Exactly.
And
I'm reiterating that.
and we're interested specifically in California training, or are we looking at
Just California.
just California? Because like you, my training was in Massachusetts. And so, so it was much, much different coming to California and having to learn. Yeah, I had to learn a whole lot when I came back to.
So to get to my question,
yes.
so one of your slides had a pyramid on it, and you mentioned at the bottom of the pyramid I think you said school counselors would do that work, more check-ins and, hey, what's going on? Hey, you know, do you need a granola bar because you didn't eat this morning? And then the next level is
I don't know
actually-
that it's that,
No, those are examples.
Right.
Those things,
Yeah.
those things happen. It's reality. It's life. It happens a lot. And then there's a next level where you said LEPs are allowed, and school psychologists are eligible to do that work. But then I think, and I may have misheard, at the top of the pyramid, that's for licensees and associates. Can LEPs work at the top of that pyramid? I was trying to understand.
Okay,
On your
yes.
slide, 'cause I wasn't clear based on what you said.
Anyone with a PPS credential
Right.
can work any of those levels
Okay.
of service. The perception, and here's where we move between, and this is my concern, is that public perception is important. And special education over the last 15 years has become extremely litigious. And special ed law is almost impossible to follow without breaking it. So schools are under so much scrutiny for the services that they provide that it's really become a crazy place to be. So to answer your question, what my point is that the most qualified people to deliver those most intensive services are LEPs or licensees who have a great deal of experience. When the service is written into an IEP, that low-level service, because again, special education is all about least restrictive environment. How are we going to minimally impact your day so that you can get through what you need to get through? The offer, we call it the offer of FAPE, free and appropriate public education. Here's our offer to you. We're going to give you this service, low-level service, introductory service, and it's going to be completed by a school-level person because they're good at that part. Then it doesn't work, and the parent comes back and says, I want more for my kid. So perception is reality.
Sure.
When a parent sees that the person delivering the service has a license, well, that has to be better. Here's another example. I can walk in as a contracted person to a school district providing the exact same service that someone in the school district could provide, but because I'm an outside contractor, oh, well, that's special. That's different. I want that. It's shiny. I want that thing. School districts often put associates, because they have a license, at this upper level, more intensive service when they have minimal experience, because on paper it looks good. It keeps them out of due process.
Okay. So I understand that. So that's helpful. Thank you. No, I had some questions. I didn't have a question. But I did mention earlier that because I was
So we were hoping to be
earlier.
able to get through this and then take our break. It sounds like you have questions
I still have more
remaining. I know
questions.
Deborah had her hand up, Christine had her hand up. We've got Christina's hand up. I don't think we're going to have to take a break. So I apologize for Chris. I right in the middle of a thought there, but if we could hold that thought, we are going to have to take a break for a few people to still clear out some of their luggage, and we'll be back at 1 o'clock.
Sure.
Well, okay, this is a bigger conversation. It looks like, and I don't know if this is on the record conversation or not. No. We have about an hour of Christy and Roseanne, maybe a little bit less than that, 45 minutes, some updates. So we still have conversation to be had on the current topic with a lot of meaningful questions. The question would be, do we want to take a half-hour lunch or a 45-minute lunch now, or do we want to just take a 15-minute break, come through, power through, and then end our day somewhat early?
My sense is that, we probably have another half hour of discussion on this topic, and if we allow an hour there, that takes us to 2 o'clock, which is kind of late to be eating, or 2:30.
Yeah, you can do a working lunch, and the status updates are literally only status updates
Yeah.
that they're doing. So they're saying maybe 10 minutes.
For the whole thing.
Okay. Do we want to do a working lunch then?
Yeah, can you give us half an hour to
Let's
bring our
do half
lunch
an
in?
hour, we'll go grab something, we'll bring it back.
Thank you.
1:15 is the revised time.
Yes.
Everyone, we're going back on the record. We'll forgive the chewing, we're making use of our time. Chris, we were in the middle of questions, and I think we left off right when I was going for Deb.
No, I was still.
Oh, you were still talking?
So, yeah.
Jonathan, you were still talking? Finish
So-
your question. Thank you.
So my next question is, I know that, and you probably would know the numbers a little bit better, I know that although ERMS is an encompassing program and service that's provided to students related to mental health services, that there's a smaller percentage of them that actually have IEPs. There are some who get ERMS services that don't have IEPs. And so I'm wondering, and this is more of a wonder than a question, sort of, how then would an LEP scope and experience and practice support their ability to provide supervision to an associate who's actually doing therapy? Because that's not necessarily educationally focused. It's actually the deep dive. And so that's something that, I don't know if you know, one, what the numbers are in terms of IEP-related ERMS versus people just getting mental health services. That's one. And then I guess we're back to the scope question, and that's probably something that we need to look at a little bit closer.
ERMS is a special education related, because it's educationally related mental health services. So the purpose of it is to, provide mental health services so students can access their educational program. But again, because of the lack of regulation, I guess is the correct word, in schools, every district has a different model. So I do know that there are some, where I live up in Santa Clarita, they call it school-based mental health. It falls under that department, but isn't necessarily related to ERMS. So they have a department of counseling that has ERMS services and school-based mental health services. So if the mental health issue is impacting a student's access to education, regardless of whether in special education or not special education, that's within our scope of practice.
Sure. Okay. And then I guess just my last thought, and then I'll pass it on to the other board members, is that one of the concerns that I also have is that that our BBS associates are prepared clinically and professionally to be able to, one, pass their licensure test.
Yes.
And then two, be able to work in settings that are outside, a variety of settings that, as you would guess, would include being outside of an educational setting.
Right.
And I would once again would wonder sort of in your training and preparation, what sort of preparation there is around family systems work, writing documentation standards around meeting medical necessity, a clinical formulation that it's outside of an educational setting, preparing an associate to do that. And so it just seems like 1,200 hours may be a pretty large number to have someone's almost half of their hours supervised by someone who may or may not have the competency or training to be able to support their broader growth that lives outside of a school-based education setting.
In my experience with the training and ASP-approved programs, there is a large component with regards to family systems, treatment planning, pulling everybody together. It's the way that I understand it. When you're in grad school, you don't know whether you're coming or going. You're like, okay, that's what they tell you to do, that's what you do, right? But the training is almost that you're providing clinical type services in an educational setting. So it's not just about servicing the goals and objectives, that's the ultimate purpose, but we also understand that there's family systems that are involved. We can do all the work that we can with the kids in the school, but if we don't fix what's going on with home with them, then nothing's going to change. Sure. So environments are important. And we talk about treatment plans. There's the goals and objectives that we have for our counseling component, but then there's also the stuff that we do that's consultative with families in outside communities. We are trained in how to do counseling notes, keep records that we need to keep. So that's all part of how we are trained to be psychologists.
Okay. And I just want to say, so I'm actually done. I want to say thank you for your time. Thank you for your presentation. I guess I would reiterate my concern. I think this is a significant part of the discussion that we have as a board, but I think it may be, in my opinion, very premature to sort of move forward with anything until we get some of the answers that were brought up earlier sort of identified and addressed, so that we could have I could have more clarity around, is this in the best interest of the public, one, and then of the associates that we oversee. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Deborah?
First of all, thank you for coming in. I think it's really important that, that the licensed educational psychologist is highlighted on all of what they do. And they do a lot. I worked in a high school for 20 years. And so I was in consultation with IEPs and 504s every single day of my life. And the LEPs, for the most part, and as you have articulated here and as Leah brought up on the website, are mostly, at least in my reference, with special ed. The special ed population, which is somewhere between 10% and 15%, and 15% is kind of ouch. We shouldn't really be that high.
We should not.
So somewhere in between those two is what you typically see in a school. Would you agree? For the special ed IEP population?
That's what you should see, yes.
Yes. Yeah, unfortunately, sometimes you see it a little higher.
Right.
So I see the need, I see what you do is absolutely imperative for special ed, because you know your laws, you know what the students need. Like you said, you treat the whole totality. It's not just the student and their learning process. It's the family system. It's, bringing in the doctor's notes. It's all of those things so we can put the child in the least restrictive environment and bring the services to that student whatever way they need it to be delivered. But what I never saw is I never saw an LEP or a school psychologist really all that interested, because they don't have the time, for the other 90% of the students. And I understand, and when I look at this sheet here, and it's all back to learning. But I have students who could come in that it doesn't come back to learning. Their parent killed themselves last night. They need help right now. It's not the school psychologist. It's not the LEP that gets called. It's the contracted MFT or LPCC or social worker that gets called, that we've contracted with. Because the LEP flat out said, we're bombarded with what we have to do with the 10 to 15. We had a 15% population, which was way over the top, but that's what we had. So we don't have that, we don't have the time. We just don't have the time. And so we had to contract out, which we did, which most schools are doing, we're hoping that they do, is to bring in the person or the license that can handle that particular issue right now. And it doesn't have to do with them and their academic wherewithal in my class, or their wherewithal to continue to come to school every day. So I think that this is just my opinion, that we have a lot of specialties. And some licenses are really good in this, and some licenses are really good in that. And I think the LEP is amazing when it comes to the special ed population. Without them, those kids would not be served. Absolutely would not be served, and those kids would be dropping out all over the place. They would be secluded from regular ed programs because they wouldn't be in the least restrictive program. They would be isolated. They would be thrown, which is what we've come a long way to get away from by law. And so I had my multitude of IEPs and 504s. Every single one of them were valid. They had, it wasn't just, I was in an IEP and there were 17 people. So I understand, that's that huge breadth and systems that you're bringing in. We had everything from the families and the social worker, because there's usually a case manager that's assigned, correct?
Yes.
Case manager that's assigned, attorneys, making sure that the kid is going to get the services that they were guaranteed by law, and making sure that the teachers were clear, and the department chair. Everybody was on the same page for this one child. And I think that you do an excellent job there, and without you, these kids would not be served. I know that. And these kids are better off for LEPs being on the campus and taking care of them and making sure that their needs are taken care of. However, I think that I've been on this board now 6 years, going on 7 years, and I have a new appreciation that I didn't have for the depth and breadth of what it takes to become an MFT, an LPCC, or a social worker. I didn't have that. I just had titles. And so maybe I would think that a license was better than a no license or something like that. But having now having the education and the background knowledge that I have about what goes into and the concern and the care, not only from the board members, but from who they represent, who come and they're part of the grand conversation all of the time, whether it be the new supervision bill or it becomes any of the new legislation that we promote or support. We have these grand conversations that sometimes go on for 2 years. And I think I would be remiss if I were to blanketly say that these are apples and apples. These are quite, in my opinion, quite different licenses. And I don't know, maybe there's an opportunity of, when one window closes, there might be an opportunity to increase the scope of an LEP's license, to include that depth or breadth. But on the other hand, there might be an opportunity for the therapists to get more breadth and depth when it comes to special education. So with that being said, I just can only speak from practice for a couple of decades that the LEPs were doing their job, and they made it very clear they were overwhelmed by their job. It was clear. We were lucky if we had 3 or 4 special ed, even teachers on campus, that we needed to go out and hire somebody that if my student came in, and more than one, as you, I'm sure, would attest, parents commit suicide or you have a child on campus commit suicide. We teachers are in the middle. We're the boots on the ground every day. We're the ones identifying the kids. We're the ones the kids come up to, or they write in their journal, or they cut and make sure that we can see their wrist. We're the ones. We have to feel confident that who we're moving the student to is competent. And I don't mean that in a nasty way. I mean competent in that that child gets the absolute best possible care they can get, because it could be a matter of life and death, as you well know, for that student. I think that the special ed population, in my opinion, just from my reference point, is very well taken care of. And I think the system works very well for them. And unfortunately, we had to pass a ton of laws and everything else to make sure they were. But I think the 90% left, or 85% left of the population has kind of been ignored. And it seems to take crises to get somebody off the pot and decide that maybe we need to bring somebody in. And so I see schools going that way now. As an initiative, you weren't here, I talked about yesterday with Fresno County Mental Health. They've got a 5-year program, and for the entire San Joaquin Valley, their goal is to put a therapist, either an LPC, MS, I never get that right, the SW, the social, the M, yeah, that one. I can never get those acronyms, that acronym. The social work, either a social worker, an LPCC, or an MFT in every school in the San Joaquin Valley. They need hundreds of people to accomplish that. I don't understand, and they're working with Fresno Unified, which is the 5th largest school district in the state of California. Now that you bring this up, I'm now don't quite understand if this was an option, a viable option for them, why wouldn't the school districts have said, excuse me, Fresno Mental Health County, we have LEPs that do this job. We don't need your MFT or your LPCC or your social worker. But they didn't. They're taking one of those 3 people and they're putting them in every school. And I would imagine that's so that they can help out the overburdened LEP. So for me, I think, as I agree with everything that's been said, there is a much grander conversation that needs to take place on the breadth and scope. Maybe, here's a teacher, a Venn diagram of one license, and here's another license, and where do they meet and where do they not meet? I mean, it may be just as simple as that. And I think what our job here is to whatever decision that we make, that at the end of the day, the public, and that would include my kids, that, I don't mean my children, I call my students my kids, that would include my students as the public safety. And they deserve to be safe, just like anybody else. And I know you would agree with that. You're all about kids. So that's where I come from. That's my history. Much grander conversation on making sure that these not only overlap, but they are going to provide as much care and responsibility and safety for students. This is the first time, I think, in 6 years that something's actually landed in my lap that I had, I'm a public member, that landed into my lap that I have a history of. Okay. So I'm grateful for that. So thank you for coming in. I really think it has been an eye-opener. People need to know all the work you do.
Thank you.
And you are on the ground, and that's a tough group, and their families. And it is a huge group. Especially if you got 10 to 15% of your population, and then you bring in the whole families, like you said, the whole family system, you're working with a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I've never talked to anybody that was from the LEP organization, so as a teacher, I say thank you. It's a lot of work, and I've just seen how overworked and overwhelmed sometimes those LEPs get. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Can I address some of your concerns?
Sure.
And this may be a clarification that the board needs. When school psychologists are trained, we're not trained to work specifically with special education, students in special education. We're trained to work with kids, all students. A school psychologist's job, LEP's job, is to provide the mental health support for all students on campus regardless of classification. We are trained in special education. That's where we get put often. It's unfortunate that you had the experience of having a school psychologist or an LEP that was overwhelmed to the point where they weren't able to see other kids and they had to have other people pulled in, because I don't think that is the idea of what it is that we are trained to do. So from my personal experience working within the schools, everything stopped when there was a crisis. If there was a student that had a suicide at home, the parent passed away, we had a teacher that passed away on campus. If there was any sort of we stopped. We put the testing aside. We put whatever IEP meeting came secondary to the mental health and support of the students on campus, because every student on a campus is my student, regardless of their classification. That's one piece of it. The other concern, why do you pull in so many other mental health professionals? I don't know if you've looked at the statistics. There's a whopping 2,000 LEPs in the state of California versus the 40,000 MFTs and the 40,000 LCSWs, and I think I don't think we're beating the LPCCs anymore either. to beat us to. And there's a statewide shortage of psychologists, school psychologists. And that's something that we as an organization are addressing. But please understand, and I know this is coming from your personal experience. Every district is different, and I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent. When I was working in the school districts, I had a TV show called Ask Dr. Jones. I had to quote it because I wasn't actually a doctor. I just played one on TV. And the purpose was to answer questions that kids had in the junior high school on air over the closed circuit TV to get kids to come in to provide support. It was being part of the campus life. So as a school psychologist, we get burdened down by what we have to do versus what we want to do. But I'll tell you what, many school psychologists find a way to balance, because the only way to stay active in that job is to create balance. If all you're doing is being overwhelmed with testing and IEPs, you're going to burn out and be done, and you're not going to be effective. So the most effective practitioners are those that do the job they're trained to do, because it's what we love to do.
So, Chris, I think Deborah had a bigger question that you may want to address as well. And that's the fact that you're I don't want to say you're talking about two different things, because you're not. Kids are kids. Well. And I 100% agree with what Chris is talking about, in that whenever we have a crisis in El Dorado County, and I should have said my county, districts call our office, and we deploy school psychologists to help in whatever crisis there is. So, I mean, that's certainly foremost, whatever the crisis is. But there's also the nuts and bolts of ERMS, which is a really separate issue, and really what we're trying to carve out for the permissions that to supervise. We really are talking about ERMS, and when you talk about ERMS, that is students with IEPs. Those are students with disabilities, and those are students who have mental health services on their IEPs. So they're required, they're mandated, they're funded through that system. So I don't think that we're suggesting that we're going to solve the problems of underserved, of the lack of mental health support in schools as a whole. I really think we're talking about a very specific, and maybe you can come back to that ERMS piece and kind of how it relates to Deborah's question.
I can. Did you want to ask first? No. Sorry, as I'm directing the questioning here at the board. No, go ahead. Okay. So yeah, no, that is, we understand as LEPs that we are a niche. And what we're best at is building the bridge between general education and special education, providing opportunities for our students that have disabilities to participate with their typical peers. So that's where we live. That's in an ideal world, school psychologists would be able to be accessible to all students on campus, right? But we don't live in an ideal world. So our training is all students. The reality of our job is that it's specific to special education, and what we're asking is specific to ERMS within the scope of our practice. Any sort of mental health issue that impacts a student's access to their educational program. And it could be that kid that's depressed because they had a parent that divorced or they had a suicide, and now they're unavailable to learn. They're not engaging in their classroom, and things are starting to spiral. So we can help bridge that gap.
I hear what you're saying, and it always comes back to the educational program. But I can have and have had students who are at the top of the class, and their education isn't flailing at all. They're still getting all of their work done, but they're still depressed, or they're still got an eating disorder, or they're pulling their hair out because they don't know if they're going to get into Harvard or not. And no, I'm serious.
No, I agree 100%.
And so a lot of anxiety issues. But they're still a 5.0 GPA,
right.
number one in their class, going to MIT, but they still have a mental disorder. And so if I use your premise of that it's got to be, they would be some type of a mental health issue that's tied back to the learning program, I don't think I could make that.
Well, but
because they're still doing stellar work.
And my question would be,
they wouldn't be eligible for anything.
Right, my question would be, is the school the right setting to be delivering that mental health service? That's an outside issue. That is a family support that should occur.
I'm glad you brought that up because that question that you just asked is yes, for me. It isn't an outside issue. It is a home issue.
Right.
And the schools now are, and I don't want to say burdened because that's not fair, but schools are becoming these kids' homes. And teachers, we are their mother, we are their father, we are their psychologist, and we aren't trained at all. I'll tell you that right off the bat. We are not trained. But we are the ones that end up handling it because they don't qualify for an IEP. They certainly don't qualify for a 504. And they're just doing fine on their academics. In fact, it might be that anxiety, because that's what they do, is they concentrate on the academics so that they can control the rest of their life. So I think there is a huge necessity, and I think that that Americans, or Californians at least, are finally waking up and saying, we need care on every campus. We need, regardless of whether it is tied to an academic program, I think it's a different conversation and a different attitude that school is home. It's not an outside issue. That they do need to be taken care of in school.
But this is a different issue.
And if I can't,
This is a different issue than what they're talking about.
Well, he said it's an outside issue, and that's not what they're trained to deal with, is outside issue, but I think that's what the conversation goes back to the Leah.
I don't know that was my point. It's not that, okay. You're correct in that schools have become clinics. The question becomes, is that what the purpose of an educational placement is? That's different. Are we trained to deal with that? Yes, that is part of our training, to deal with kids that have mental health issues, regardless of whether or not it impacts their education. That's not within the scope of our practice and what the purpose of an LEP is. So we're not asking to be supervisors of your general therapist that's on campus seeing general education kids who are dealing with the depression. We're talking about specifically ERMS services.
Okay, then I guess I'm confused, because I thought it was you wanted to be able to supervise any BBS licensee.
I think
Let's go Christina.
Right, within our scope of practice.
Yeah,
Within our
let's go
scope of practice.
Christina, and then over to Gabriel.
So I actually, in my previous life, was the 26.5 clinician. So I get where, Chris, where you're coming from, because I can tell you, employed by the county agency, being, part of the team, I'm not sure if I was, I had all the knowledge I really needed, to help with, that particular population. Because, when the services was being provided, then, you're asking also for the, for the registrant or the licensees, to be able to have that very specific knowledge about, the providing mental health services in the education setting. And educational codes are far more complicated, than probably, in our own licensed population. Well, for that particular mental health services provided in the school. And you see also, in the trend that, there's so much school issues, I don't need to say it, we know that there are definitely a lot of the mental health issues, happening in school, whether it's just, ERMS or not ERMS. But I think, the point being is that, I think that if we agree that, for one, the need is there, And for two, maybe, the competency, it's a concern. I think we can certainly, down the road hash it out. But I think the most important thing, what they're asking for, what I heard and remember, that at the Policy and Advocacy Committee meeting, you guys are not asking, that the LEP supervise the entirety of the clinical hours. So we were talking about, that it's only for a certain amount, so that can be the balance for the, for the LEP supervisor, or for the registrants to be able to gain clinical experience from all, from different aspects. So I think, I don't think, Chris, you kind of raised it, raised that proposal up, but I thought that was on, that was being discussed in the last meeting. I want to bring it up and just kind of, see where it's coming from. See that, just to remind everybody that, it's not like nowadays, LP is going to take over. And the other thing, I just want to, remind the board also, I think this is a wonderful thing that, the CASP is, coming to talk to us. This is a conversation, because of reality, I think, you like it or not, they can pursue their own legislation. And then if we don't participate in that conversation and be able to, to kind of hash out the differences, I think we're not also, doing our due diligence. So, so I just really want to encourage, board members to be open-minded, and to continue that conversation, and also get stuck in our own professional, and especially, mental health, in school, and ERMS, the ERMS program are so multidisciplinary. So, so mental health has to be on the table. You like it or not, they are there. So we want to train the social workers or all our licensees, that be able to that what stopped them to learn from the experts, from the people who actually know the system.
Thanks, Christina. Vika.
I could just, I'm an MFT and a PPS, but in the first 12 years of my life, I did just psychotherapy. And then I went over to the schools. It was really two different worlds, and the learning curve was amazing. And I would have to say I have actually, in the last 30 years of my life, become a better therapist because of my understanding of the impact of schools, which aren't always positive, on families, not only individuals, and peer influence, et cetera, et cetera. And I almost wish in my initial MFT training, I had had more experience in the schools at some level. It would have been extremely helpful in my first 12 years of doing family therapy. So I do see that I agree with you, that it would be to learn from the experts while you're going through training. I'm not sure that that's such a bad idea.
Thank you.
So I think, Gabriel, did you have one more comment there?
Actually, I did. So originally, I had said that I would be open for LEPs to sign off on hours, provided that the LEPs or the associates working in the schools would only be counted for the specific competencies that pertain to the educational components and not other mental health aspects of it. I also mentioned that I would hope the LEP would have the good common sense to refer out, because I wouldn't want the schools to be the psychotherapy go-to place for the students. That the LEPs in their capacity would be able to send students off because their plate is too full or because they have bigger and better things to do. Not that you're not capable of providing services, but I think that if everybody works together, then everybody can get a little piece of the pie.
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
Thank you. So I think we've had certainly a robust conversation, and I think we'll have more conversations as it starts moving into something that we can take a look at.
Just a quick
One more?
comment.
Okay.
I'm interested in our stakeholders if they have any thoughts on it, because if we're going to be
if we're going to have him come back again with more data or more evidence and stuff, that some of our concerns, if there's anything that they need too, or where they're standing.
Absolutely. I had public comment just right down there, underlined. So I was getting to it. I was just going to let Chris sit down first. And then but I think I think for the board, I think we're good. We've asked our questions, we made our comments. I think we'll. Thank you, Chris, for today. Absolutely, for today. It's an ongoing dialogue and work in progress. So thank you
I
again,
do appreciate
Chris.
your time, and all of the questions have been very thought-provoking. Thank you.
Kathy.
Hi, Kathy Atkins with Exempt. I want to first thank Heidi and Chris for coming to give the presentation. They reached out, CASP reached out to Exempt to start communications on this issue. And so far, we've had sort of mixed reactions from our stakeholders internally, and we're working to sort of weed out what's, where the reactions come from, all the issues that have been brought up today, we're taking a look at, and we've been working with CASP on what something could look like moving forward that would be a consumer protection for the children, as well as increasing potentially jobs for associates and trainees, license portability, all those issues we're taking a look at, and we are working offline with CASP, and we look forward to continued discussion as we move through 2019. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Rebecca Gonzalez, National Association of Social Workers, California chapter. We also put out an email to our school social workers to get some feedback, and we also had some questions, but I think a lot of the questions were answered by clarifying that the proposal was narrow as far as just supervising them for hours. I do think that they agree that the number of hours they should be able to count towards licensure should be limited, like we've already talked about. I think there's still, well, I know this isn't moving real fast because there isn't a bill proposal right now, and I'm sure that, my school social workers will still be following this closely, but I do think a lot of their questions were answered by what the actual proposal is. Thank you.
Kenneth Edwards, California Association for LPCC. What she said.
Succinct. To the point. Ditto. Any other public comment before we move on to the next agenda? Whew. Well, thank you for that. Roseanne, I do believe that you are coming back on to talk about our board-sponsored legislation.
Yes, so this will just be a quick update. The legislative season has concluded with the board, with the governor at the end of September signing or making decisions on all bills that made it to his desk. All three of the board-sponsored legislation pieces were signed by the governor. That's AB 93 about supervision, AB 2117, which is just some cleanup about MFT, basically our licensing laws, and then SB 1491, which was our omnibus bill for the year. Those were all signed. AB 456 was also signed by the governor. That extends the 90-day rule to ASWs and also reduces their required supervision hours from 3,200 to 3,000. We had AB 1436 signed, which is the suicide prevention training requirement. That begins in January of 2021. We also had AB 2296 signed. That was a bill sponsored by CalPIC that allows LPCCs to be child custody evaluators and then makes some changes to the core content requirements for LCSWs. So with and then also AB 2138, which was the, it makes some changes regarding the board's denial of applications for certain criminal convictions. So we're working on all of those, on doing outreach for all of those bills right now. We've worked really hard to reach out to the schools and put some really comprehensive information on our website. There's a lot of changes this year, more than other years. So we really recommend that that everybody take a look at that, recommend to their colleagues that they take a look at that. It's right on the top banner on our website. There's about an 8-page document on there that you can read through about some of the law changes. And so in terms of other bills, there's a summary of the outcomes of everything the board took a position on. One of the bills that the board supported that was vetoed was the peer support specialist certification bill. The governor did veto that bill. He stated that currently those professionals are used as medical providers without a certificate, and that they recommended that the bill be worked through the budget process. So that is the legislative update for the year.
Betty, I have a comment. Sorry, I always have something to say. On the 90-day rule piece, I had pulled the supervision language in the 90-day rule information from our previous board meeting, and I've photocopied those and I've sent them to all our agencies, and we're getting them to our supervisors, and we've gotten them to all our students. And I'm hoping you'll do something simpler and easier to read, I guess, for the stakeholders. And as some feedback for that, on the 90-day rule piece, you put at the bottom of that list the fingerprinting piece, where they have to have had the fingerprinting in order to include the 90-day rule. That really needs to go to the top of that conversation. Because it seems like, you can do the 90-day rules still, and LCSWs can do, and then at the very bottom it says, but you have to be fingerprinted. So
Are you referring to the current memo that's out there for stakeholders?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we can take a look at that.
Yeah, if you just put that 90-day rule, the fingerprinting at the top of that, I think it would make it clear. I've gotten feedback from lots of different agencies and supervisors.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any further board discussion on this? Comments from the public? Nope? Okay, well then we'll move on. Christy, I think you have the next item, the status of board rulemaking proposals?
Yes, that would be me. So the first one is the enforcement process regulations approved by the board in February 2017, and it's been in DCA initial review since July 2017. I know that Roseanne has gotten some feedback. Maybe, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, we had that returned, that proposal was returned to us by agency on November 19th of this month. There were some pretty significant changes, so we need to discuss internally and consult with legal on our next steps on where to go from there.
Okay. The next regulation package deals with exam rescoring, application abandonment, and the subsequent registration fee for APCCs. And that has been in initial review, and it's currently at agency. And they've given me some feedback, and I'm working on that, but I'm focusing right now on implementation of all the legislation that's passed. So, but that's it. That's something working on. And then the supervision regulations, which were approved by the board back in November 2016, we set that aside, waiting for AB 93 to pass. And as you know, I brought back some changes to you all recently, so that will make its way through the initial review process early next year. We'll introduce that because, again, we're focusing on implementation and, articles and forms and all of that. So that's the priority. So any questions on any of that?
I'm just going to add the last piece of information that's under the rulemaking agenda item is the process for us to complete the rulemaking proposal. On the first page, it's titled Initial Phase, and there's 13 steps. So when we speak about we're still in the initial process, this is what we're referring to. We have to complete steps 1 through 13 before we can submit the packet to OAL for the 45-day comment period. After that 45-day comment period, if you turn the page on the back half, you'll see other steps 1 through 13 that look identical to the first phase. So this is a follow-up to the conversation that we had with DCA Legal's Counsel and the steps in the process for the entire rulemaking process. So essentially what you're doing, you see, is you've got the same steps that occurred the initial phase. You get your notice, and then you got to repeat those same steps after the notice. So, which is why it's now taking us, it's the reason it's taking us so long.
Any board discussion?
Just a quick step back that Christina pointed out, she had a question. We didn't really talk about the portability piece, about the LEPs. It was sort of brought up by our stakeholders saying that they're looking at the portability piece, but I just wanted to note that we didn't go into that.
I can respond to that too.
Rosanna actually prepared a wonderful, research findings, about different, states and, whether the LEP and whatnot. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, because I know it's only information. So I just want to bring it up that, Roseanne, all the wonderful work that you have done. And
It was really just included, we talked about it at the Policy and Advocacy Committee meeting. It was in response to some questions that had been raised. So I included it just as its background in case anybody had any questions. We had the information, so.
And in terms of portability, I can share that the model that it seems to be gaining some traction is to treat the applicants in two ways. If you are an initial applicant, never practice, you'll be subject to that state's requirements. If they treat you as a licensee applicant like we're going to do, then it's not going to be a problem for portability, because they're not going to look at the supervised hours.
that seems like it's the pretty consistent
Yes.
way to handle the portability pieces.
Exactly.
Yeah, so, and that's good to
Cross
know.
your fingers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, I just want to bring it up so that, also board members know that, the staff has been also done some work and,
Thank you. Thank you, Christina. Is there anything more in that, the timeline regulatory issue? No?
No, it's, I'll note that agency had our rulemaking package for 60 days. I think Mr. Markov indicated they had 30 days to review it. It is a big package, so I can see why it might have taken them a little bit longer. Yeah, I'm hoping maybe at the next quarterly meeting, at the directors or perhaps your meeting, they'll start talking about the rulemaking process. I can share with you, a lot of the EOs are very, very nervous about the rulemaking process we have to initiate for AB 2138, because all the boards and bureaus that are affected by that are going to be submitting their rule packages at the same time. There is a structured timeline, but it's extremely tight, and it's allowing right now only, was 90-day review by legal under their proposal, I think it was, and that's not been our experience yet. Nobody's really gotten anything out of legal in 90 days, so yeah, all we can do is continue to make sure to submit it as clean a package as we can, and then just follow up. So.
Thank you, Kim. So I think we've concluded the bulk of our business. Are there any suggestions for future agenda items? Public, Kathy?
Yes, I just, I apologize, I feel like I should know the answer, but I feel over the last couple of years, there's been conversation about the two six-year rules related to private practice, as well as when you apply for licensure, looking back those 6 years. And I feel like that was discussed, and then it kind of just fell off the face of the earth. And I don't know if something happened and I forgot, but I was just curious if if that's coming back, or if that's going to be on a future agenda item, or.
I know that we've looked at it, and the last time we looked at it, I think we decided we weren't going to change it. I know it continues to be somewhat of an issue, and I will share that that's one of the reasons that motivated us to start tracking the subsequent registration applications, so that we had some real data to see who that affected. So I could see it coming back, but I don't, as to the timeline, I don't know.
Okay. I'll do some research because I do feel like maybe a year ago there was a meeting about exceptions, and not that that was a good or bad thing. I know there was a lot of discussion about it, but we'll reach out to the
that'd be great.
BBS and, okay, thank you.
Is there any public comment for items not on the agenda? Well, I think with that, we are going to adjourn our meeting for today. Thank you, everyone, for your participation, and we'll see you at the next board meeting.
Sounds good, thank you.